Tonight, we bring you the second part of our conversation examining international justice issues. And once again, I'm joined by David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Today, we want to look at international courts and tribunals. Recent international court cases have brought hope to justice activists. But will these victories catapult into more success? Hi, David.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. I want to begin with a case that's been in the headlines for much of this year, and that, of course, is the arrest and the indictment against the Bosnian Serb leader, Ratko Mladic. Remind us again, what is he accused of?
Well, Ratko Mladic was the Bosnian Serbian commander in the horrific breakdown of order in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, accused of many things, but among them the massacre of thousands of Bosnian men and boys at Srebrenica. And it's a significant indictment because he is one of the very few remaining senior officials to be caught and indicted and put on trial at the International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. Now, the ICTY, as it's called, is one of two important international bodies set up in the 1990s. This one was set up in 1993 to prosecute people suspected of being guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Balkan Civil Wars.
International
Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And the other was the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, set up in 1994. And they've been very active. They both have limited mandates. The United Nations authorized their creation, but actually sort of set timetables as to their operation. And both of them are due to be winding up fairly soon, at which point these kinds of cases will be taken over by the International Criminal Court, a permanent body established in The Hague to prosecute these kinds of crimes.
Here's the thing, though. Both those courts were set up in the 90s. And on the same day that Mladic is arrested, a high-profile Tutsi genocidaire, Bernard, I'm going to say his name wrong, but Munyagishari from Rwanda was arrested. And I'm wondering, I mean, aside from the timing that it was the exact same day, but what do these two high-profile indictments mean for the progress at large for international criminal courts and tribunal? Does it say anything?
Well, it means that powerful people are not immune to capture and prosecution. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be found guilty. Now, if I had to bet, I'd have to bet that Mladic for sure will be found guilty. It'll take some time. That'll be a long-running trial, but there's lots of evidence of his particular guilt in Srebrenica and elsewhere.
Okay, David, on the same day that Mladic is arrested, there's another high-profile indictment, and that is of the Tutsi genocidaire Bernard Munyagishari from Rwanda. And I'm wondering, aside from the timing, what do these two high-profile indictments mean for the progress at large for the international criminal courts and tribunal, if anything?
Well, they're a sure sign that if you're powerful, you're not necessarily immune. So the growing international law arm will eventually catch up with you. Doesn't necessarily mean that you will be found guilty. Now, in these two particular cases, the odds would have to be that they would be found guilty of the crimes of which they're charged, because there's, frankly, quite a lot of evidence against both. But actually, if you look at the total number of people indicted at either the ICTY or the ICTR, only roughly half wind up being found guilty, which to my mind is a pretty good sign that these are not kangaroo courts, right? These are processes that are taken seriously with very strict standards of evidence, very high burdens of proof, which is as it should be for a criminal case. And I think that's a healthy development because it will deter skepticism about the reliability of this kind of process when essentially foreigners are trying people from an entirely different country, different continent, and where there is a lot of media coverage that might incline people to suspect that it would be difficult for jurists to be objective.
Let me be a skeptic for a moment, though. You know, for perhaps as many as the Mladics that get taken there, people like Omar alBashir, the president of Sudan, are off running free. So does it really say that you will eventually be caught up with? He's been indicted.
Well, you can't be tried until you can be caught. Right, so that's a prior question, but of course it's not the job of the tribunals or these courts to catch the people who are indicted. That's the job of other people. And primarily it's the job of officials in the territories where these people live and are hiding. Now, Bashir as an sitting head of state isn't going to be caught until he's no longer a sitting head of state. But if he is caught, that would be, I think, just another example of how these things normally function. It's getting increasingly difficult for heads of state to escape prosecution. The idea that as a head of state you should be immune from prosecution is an old idea that's losing traction. Relatively few people around the world now buy that idea. The last remaining people who do are sitting heads of state who themselves fear that they'll be prosecuted once they're no longer in office.
Many of them in Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah. And the downside to this, of course, is it gives them an incentive not to do peaceful transition, not to give up power, not to accept a deal and go into exile somewhere, because if they do, they may be handed over to some international criminal tribunal.
We see that perhaps playing out in the Middle East. We'll talk more about that one tomorrow. I want to read you something Stuart Patrick wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations. Here's what he had to say about the recent victories that we talked about at the ICC. Before getting too excited, we need to put these victories in perspective. International criminal tribunals are rife with shortcomings and should remain only a secondary option when local forms of delivering justice are impossible. Consider the uneven record of the ICTY and the ICTR, those are the international tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, respectively. Both tribunals took years to establish and begin criminal proceedings, and neither has enjoyed the resources or scope to try but a handful of those accused of atrocities. In a decade and a half, ICTY has managed to sentence 64 defendants and acquit 12. ICTR's record is even more modest, having sentenced 46 and acquitted 8. Now, David, you said, that's not bad, but I'm wondering, what are the primary operational shortcomings of these courts?
Well, to some extent, this is a glass half full, glass half empty issue. So whatever your expectations are, you're going to look at what's happened at these tribunals and you're going to decide they're disappointing or they're fabulously successful, right? So first point is you got to decide what your expectation is. Secondly, these courts, as I said, don't do everything themselves. They require, to function properly, that there be enough order on the ground in these parts of the world that people can, in fact, be found, arrested, extradited. That there's enough order on the ground that evidence can be assembled in a reliable way, that the defendants have access to proper defense, in other words, people who are willing and able to mount a defense on their behalf, competent defense. All of this is difficult, and nobody imagined that this would ever be easy, especially when you're dealing with war-torn areas, right? Where you have a mess, cleaning up the mess takes a long time no matter what part of the cleanup job you're talking about. And this is frankly just one part of the cleanup job.
Part of the reason we have these systems is to also, not just to catch the bad guys, but hopefully to deter them. And if we look at people like Mladic or Karadzic in the former Yugoslavia, despite them being named as suspected war criminals, they went on to slaughter many, many innocent civilians. So does this really play a role, these tribunals, in its ability to deter war crimes?
Too early to tell. I don't think these particular guys had much opportunity to reflect on whether these things should deter them. They were brand new. They were just being set up. They were still paperwork to a large extent. So, if I were in their shoes, I imagine I wouldn't have paid them much mind. I would have focused my time and energy on doing the awful things I was bent on doing. So the question about deterrence really is one that has to be answered down the road.
Let me ask you that question in a more modern day context. Qaddafi, still out slaughtering innocent civilians.
Well, he's clearly not deterred about the slaughtering. I mean, he's very, very iron-fisted in his approach to dealing with domestic unrest, and in particular with challenges to his own position. That's a bit standard. The question I would ask is he deterred from negotiating some kind of transition because he might be handed over to an international tribunal? Possibly. I haven't interviewed him. I don't know who has actually asked him that question, but it's possible that one reason that he's being particularly tough is this ironic one that he could face international prosecution if he's flexible. I just want to add one more thing about that particular quotation, which represents as a complaint that these things are secondary. That's not a complaint. They're secondary by design. Everybody's preference is that national legal systems handle these kinds of crimes. And in fact, the The Rome Statute that set up the International Criminal Court says explicitly that the ICC will only operate as a court of last resort. It's everybody's preference that national courts handle these kinds of crimes, as they do in most places.
We also know that because of politics, there are some political leaders who I think arguably will probably never be brought in front of one of these kinds of tribunals. And I'm thinking of Tiananmen and the leaders there. Given that, if justice presumes equality before the law, then how is this just?
There's a few reasons why certain leaders never are brought to account for what they do. One reason is that often leaders who do these horrible things are quite old and they don't wind up living very long, even after they're out of office. So if they manage to hide or are protected by powerful people in their own countries long enough, they'll get away without prosecution, but that's because they will die. In fact, some of these high-profile people have actually died while being prosecuted, and their cases are accordingly dropped. Slobodan Milosevic is the best example of that. Probably would have been found guilty, but he didn't live long enough to be found guilty. But then again, there are other countries, such as, for example, the United States. A lot of people think that there are plenty of former American officials that ought to be tried for crimes against humanity, including, for example, Henry Kissinger, who authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, and some people I believe firmly was complicit in the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. Kissinger probably will never be tried for these because he's very well protected by the United States and because he's actually careful not to travel outside the United States to places where he might be arrested and handed over for prosecution. So he is in fact limited in what he can do globally by this consideration, but because he's an American and very well protected by the United States, you're probably right that he won't be prosecuted.
David, one of the criticisms, though, about these tribunals is exactly what you're saying. The U.S. hasn't signed on. There's a perception problem, and it allows critics, a lot of them saying, you know what, there's too many African leaders that have been tried, that this is really a system with a post-colonial bias. What do you say about that?
It's not a ridiculous concern. You don't want to set up a westernized system to prosecute people who are entirely non-Western. On the face of it, that would be problematic, even if it were done with the best of intentions. But I would say two things to that. One is that if you actually look at the composition of these tribunals, and in particular the ICTR, you'll actually find a lot of African names among the judges, among the prosecutors, among the people investigating the crimes. And secondly, of course, the genocide in Rwanda took place in Rwanda, and so the people being indicted are overwhelmingly going to be Rwandans. The only two places where we've seen these sort of large-scale organized genocidal activities in the last couple of decades are the Balkans and in Africa. And we've seen more recently events in countries like the Ivory Coast, have yet to see a fully functioning international criminal tribunal set up for what's going on there. But the sad fact is that's where you see these things. You don't see them in the United States, you don't see them in Western Europe. If you did see them there, presumably you'd have prosecutions.
Okay, David, thanks for the second night of our 5-night conversation. We'll see you again tomorrow.